Several years ago I was taking care of my father's place while he was vacationing in Montreal. There was only myself and my sister at the house during the time. And after a fine meal she had retired to her room. While I watched television lazily on the leather couch, I felt myself drifting off to sleep when the doorbell rang. I glanced up at the living room clock and thought to myself, who on earth could that be at 11:30 in the evening? Quote, I looked through the front window, which had a clear view of the front steps and door. And there stood a scraggly-looking fellow, rather untidy in appearance, with shaggy dirty blonde hair, an unshaven face and glasses. Despite initially giving pause at the time of night, I didn't think much of it at the time and proceeded to the front door to greet the stranger. When I answered, politely asking, "Hello, can I help you?" he simply asked if James was home. Backstory time. Several years ago, there was a dude named James who did stay with my dad. He worked at the same company as my father but lived in New York. He and my father had struck an arrangement that he would stay at my dad's house during the week, while going back to his family in NY during the weekends. However, at the time of my story he had long since retired from the company and moved back to NY permanently. Normally I'm a pretty cautious dude, but this previous story made me drop my guard a little bit. Creepy guy, asking for a fairly popular name should have been the first red flag. Not thinking much of his request, I told him James no longer lived here, and creepy guy thanked me and was on his way. As he made his way down the steps, I noticed his light brown Cadillac had out-of-state plates but left it at that once he drove off down the street. Locking the door behind me, I flopped back on the couch and continued my late-night zoning out on the Discovery Channel. I began to fall asleep again while another episode of Wild Discovery was starting up when the door bell rang again. I didn't need to look up at the clock to realize that it was past midnight. Glancing quickly out the front window, I saw it was the same fellow who had asked for James 30 minutes earlier. My first red flag. As I approached the front door, my mind began to worry a little, so as I unbolted the deadlock and opened the door, I made sure to keep my foot behind the door just in case. Once again, I politely asked, "Hello, can I help you?" He shuffled his feet and began to tell his tale. I know this will sound a little weird, but a few years ago I was doing construction in this area, and I noticed there was a beautiful woman who lived here. She had a beautiful pair of white shoes, and I was wondering if I could have them. My mind began to race. True, there was construction going on in the area here a few years ago, as the neighborhood had recently been developed. But there was no woman living here several years ago. My father was the first owner of this house, and he and my mother had long been divorced. Not to mention that my mom lived in another country. My father hadn't had any girlfriends until recently. In fact, that's why he was in Montreal, to spend time with his girlfriend who would end up being his future wife. I answered that there was no woman living here, and that the shoes in question would probably not be in the house. He insisted with, "But they were the most beautiful pair of white shoes. I really want them. I'll buy them off you. Here I have." He cut himself off to search his pockets, which only produced about $10. I shook my head, but he continued to ask, "Please, man? I'll give you the money. Just let me inside and let me look for the shoes. I really need to have them." "The shoes you're looking for aren't here, and I think you better leave," I said firmly, and began to close the door. Alarm bells were going off in my head, and I knew I had to stop this before things got any weirder. As I began to close the door in what felt like slow motion, I saw him moving his arms forward in an attempt to block me from closing the door. As I slammed it shut and locked the deadbolt as quickly as I could, I heard him turning the doorknob and trying to open the door. Once he realized that shit wasn't going to happen, I heard him tear down the steps. As I ran to the front window to try and get his license plate number, he had already started the car and began to peel off. I was too late. By this point adrenaline had kicked in and I began searching the house for a weapon. Even though there were several swords hanging on the wall, I decided to go for my trusty golf driver as I went around the house making sure that all possible entrances were locked. After waking my sister and quickly telling her the situation, I called the police. Once they arrived, I told them what had happened, and after the officer did his police thing, he ended our conversation with, "This is the weirdest story I've ever heard." Every once in a while when I close my eyes I can see his face and hands moving towards my own face, trying to thwart the closing of the door and ruining whatever devious plans he had for the evening. I sometimes wonder what might have been if I hadn't been cautious. If I hadn't been wary about a stranger in the middle of the night. If I had bought into his story about the white shoes. If he had managed to get his arm into the doorway. But I never wonder for too long. And am just thankful for things turning in my favor as opposed to his. As one might imagine, this event greatly influenced my own habits and behaviors. Doors and windows are always locked and secured. Cautiousness about opening my door at night. Hell, just unexpected knocks on the door at any time of day will give me pause. My perspective on what I find scary has drastically changed. So it's not that I'm afraid. I've just come to fully realize how lucky my sister and I were that night. And while things worked out in the end for us, why allow the opportunity for things to go wrong by not addressing a few simple things requiring just a little bit of due diligence? Sometimes when I think back on this story, I try to do research to see if any similar events, curious crimes, or even perhaps anything more deviant happening in the area around the same time frame. But my research and Google Fu always come up short. It's probably for the best.